Wow. And that actually, it actually was going to bring me to the next question about populism, and what that term, how we understand that. But in both of your answers, I want to ask like 500 follow-up questions. But, it is, when you think about what Danielle said, Tim, about, how you innovate and build and try to have some kind of egalitarian democracy, which is frankly probably more aspirational than democracy, and something that I would probably argue that no country has ever done, and that no democracy has ever done. But coming up against that is that in our democratic culture, the whole issue of populism is not just a double-edged sword, but even if you come from a union, we think about things, when you think about class, we think about, we're part of the populace. We're not part of the elite. But in thinking through what has happened in the United States as well as the globe, the person who is now president of the United States took the mantle and the mantra of populism. And the question now is Trumpism a form of extreme right-wing populism like you see in the French neo-fascist Le Pen or the Alternative for Germany? Is that why there is the constant targeting of the other, mindful of the fact that in the United States of America, the other will become more dominant than what is the white male? Or is it faux populism? Or is it pseudo-populism, as Tim has said in a recent podcast? In light of all the efforts that Trump and the Republican Congress have just done to massively redistribute wealth away from the people who voted for them, what does this all mean? And how do institutions like ours, who have actually tried to be the connective tissue for working folks and have seen our work as populist in nature, how do we actually try to deal with this? And I don't care which of you answer this first, but this is the question that keeps me up at night in terms of what, how do we make sense of this?
Okay, so let me riff on the question for a minute, and let me try to answer it. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that I agree with you that there's some kind of international trend, but that should give us pause, or at least if there are any good liberals out there who assume that everything which is globalized is going to be good. It's pretty clear at this moment that the far right is far more globalized than any rival political formation at the moment. Just to give you an example, which is kind of trivial, but which is from the work that I do, if you look at the flag that the separatists in southeastern Ukraine chose for their flag, it was the battle flag of the Confederacy of the United States of America. And that's globalization, right? I mean, that's the borrowing of memes from other cultures. And so it's not, I wouldn't say that like Le Pen and Orban and Putin and Trump are all the same thing, but there is a lot of communication going on, and in that way it's global. Another general remark I want to make is about race. I mean, I'm not sure if this is good news or it's bad news. It's probably bad news. It's entirely possible to tribalize a democratic society even without the race. So in Poland, for example, you have two political parties that are not so different from the two that we have. They basically have a center-right party and a far-right party, just like us. And and their society is tribalized along very similar lines, and they have the same kinds of statistics of people will not marry those from the other party, right? Parents are ashamed if you're dating someone from the other party, right? Which, by the way, in the U.S. is already more resonant, at least statistically, than it is with race. I mean, Democrats too, Democrats and Republicans don't want their kids marrying people from the other party. So you can tribalize even without the race. So no matter what the numbers are, there's going to be a problem. So I want to speak, and so that leads me to what I want to say about populism, because the way I think populism works in this country can't be understood without getting inside white people and without understanding that racism is basically, racism is directed against black people in this country, but racism is basically a trap that some white people set for other white people. It's a substitute for policy, and that's what I mean by this pseudo-populism. So it's very nice when Randy asks, like, is this a variety of pseudo-populism? Although, as if pseudo-populism were some kind of like term that you'll find in the Encyclopedia of Populism. It's just something that I said, but I mean something by it. And what I mean is, now speaking directly to Randy's question, is that there is a long and strong tradition of populism which has two parts. It has a rhetorical part, where you say the things that you're not supposed to say, but it also generally had a substantial part, or a policy part, where you make proposals about how you might redistribute wealth, for example, right? Now, what I mean by pseudo-populism is that what we have in the United States is only half of that. There's the rhetorical part, which says, yes, I'm going to say the things that are on your minds, right? Trump says, I am your voice, which is a Hitler quote, by the way. I am your voice, right? Ich bin eure Stimme in the original German. I'm your voice. I'm the one who speaks for you. I say the things that you want to say, but you were afraid to. I break the taboos, right? That's what people call populism. But in my view, it's not populism because it doesn't come with the other half of the proposition. Once you break the rhetorical rules, you're then supposed to break the rules of distribution, which it's not just that they're not doing that, it's that they're doing the opposite. So how does pseudo-populism work then? Because like a lot of Democrats are stumped by this, or a lot of nice, rational people who I like to think of as my friends are stumped by this. Well, how does it work that you take stuff away from people and they keep voting for you? Or worse, they vote for you because you're taking stuff away from them. How does that work? What's that dynamic? Okay, so to set this up, let's first think of how politics is supposed to work. The way that politics is supposed to work in a two-party democracy is that Party A has one set of policy proposals which speaks to the interests of these guys. Party B has a set of policy proposals that speaks to the interests of these guys. These people are somewhere in the middle. But both parties are proposing some version of the future in which there are different policies than we have now. Okay? So both parties are saying, hey, the future is going to be better than the present. They just have different ideas, and they're offering those ideas to different sets of people. That's not what's happening now. So that's a positive sum game, right? We're saying hey, there's going to be more stuff, there's going to be more good stuff, there are going to be gains. That's not what's happening now. What's happening now is not gain, but pain. Literally pain, right? So who brought Trump to office? Where were the decisive places that brought him to office? Which counties did he take that Obama took in 2012? Which counties did he take where he took 20, 30 more points than Romney when Romney won those counties? Those are counties where people are committing suicide, right? People know this, right? Those are counties which are in public health crisis. Those aren't the only people who voted for Trump, but that was the difference. That's what pushed him over in Ohio. That's what pushed him over in Pennsylvania. Every single county that he won in Pennsylvania that Obama won 4 years ago is an opioid crisis. Every single one. Every single county in Ohio that he won, except for one, that he took from Obama, was an opioid crisis. And I just use that as a shorthand for public health crisis, misery, right? So there is real pain. And the last thing that people who are committing suicide and dying, deaths of misery need is for their health care to be taken away. That's literally the last thing they need. The last thing that they need is a new tax law, which is going to make social insurance much more difficult. Which the Republicans have openly said, we're going to use this now to create a deficit so we can do away with what remains of the welfare state. That's the last thing. So how can that possibly work? Here's the way that it works. It works like this. And just stay with me here. You're no longer talking about gain, right? I'm no longer saying there's more in the future. I'm saying there's less. It's going to be pain. And the benefit that you get by voting for me is that you get to feel like you're on the side of the people who are dealing out the pain. Think about Celebrity Apprentice. What's Celebrity Apprentice? An oligarch comes to you and he says you're fired. He gives you the pain. And what's the fun of watching Celebrity Apprentice or The Apprentice? You feel like you're on the side. You're with the guy who's dealing out the pain, right? This is how sadopopulism works. You take the pain because you identify with the guy. And you think, I'm on the side of the people who are dealing out the pain. And then here's where the race part comes in. Because if you're white, you think, well, I'm self-sufficient, I don't need the government, which is, by the way, totally untrue of white people. By the way, because white people don't realize how much the government does for them. This is sort of our big problem, right? They don't realize how much the government does for them, and therefore when you take the government away from them, they're like, okay, now I commit suicide. I'm sad to say, but that's basically true, right? Look at the statistics for white males committing suicide, right? 20 American veterans commit suicide every day. 50 American farmers commit suicide every day. 50 every day. And those are the very same white people who talk about the independence and how they don't need the government, right? There's a big problem. So the way this works is you think, I'm willing to suffer, I'm independent, I'm that lonely pioneer, I can do it. But what you're also thinking is the people who are going to suffer more are the immigrants, right? The Muslims, and above all, the blacks. That's what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, I'm standing up straight as an American doing it on my own. I'm going to suffer a little bit, but those other people are going to suffer more. The way pseudo-populism works is that politics shifts from being a positive-sum game into a negative-sum game, where it's not about gain, it's about pain. It's not about distributing gain anymore. It's about distributing pain. And the way you can side with somebody like this is you think, well, I'm kind of with him. We are dishing out the pain to other people, right? So that's about as good as I can do, trying to explain what's going on. But we have to have an explanation which helps us to see how this is working, right? We can't just say to people, "Oh, your vote's irrational." That's not going to be enough. So there we go. That's sadopopulism.
So that was incredibly rich and thought-provoking. I think I'm going to say something smaller, but I hope it is also helpful.
Well, you said something pretty big a few minutes ago, which we'll get back to.
Alrighty. I think I certainly have found the conversations about populism confusing, partly for the reasons that you suggested. That is, there are plenty of us who, in our civic work extremely hard to connect ordinary people and their needs and interests to governmental efficacy. And surely there are elements of populism in that. The way I've come to think about it has got more to do with a social contract concept. That is, I take it that populism names the phenomenon when the people, ordinary people, no longer want to have their political experience mediated through elites of one kind or another. Whether those are bureaucratic elites or media elites, they just want that all swept away. They want a direct contract, in effect, with a guy in charge and no more mediation. But I think the other half that goes with that, and I think part of what's caused the sort of kind of populism we're seeing, is the problem of technocracy. So technocracy is when people are setting policy really absent attention to and consideration of ordinary people. And I have to say, I think many of my economist colleagues have been guilty of this approach to policymaking. And let me just give you a very concrete example. In the last year, I've had conversations with economists who have said to me, yes, when we thought about globalization, we modeled a 20-year transition. We, expected the whole thing to work its way through in 20 years. And, that's that, neat and clean, 20 years, no problem, off you go. Now, it's one thing to model that in terms of macroeconomics and numbers and so forth. It's quite another thing. But what does 20 years of disruption mean in the lives of particular people and particular communities? And so the notion that you would set policy based purely on that economic, technocratic expertise and not marry it to the kind of expertise that ordinary people have about what are the real prospects for mobility? Like, how do I get another job? Do I really have to reskill at the age of 55? Like, is that really what you're talking about for me? And I think that was a failure on the part of our elites, in all honesty, with regard to the social contract. So I see the kind of populism that we're living through as a reaction to a failure of, whatever, people in think tanks, people in universities, et cetera, to understand how to partner their expertise with the kind of knowledge that ordinary people have. So I think to your phrase that one of the things that AFT does is try to establish a connective tissue, that couldn't be more important. I think another word for that connective tissue is like the social contract, right? The ways in which people put different resources on the table, partnering together to try to make the world better for ordinary people. That's how I've started thinking about this issue.